right, hello. Thank you all for coming out after lunch. Apparently, the screen doesn't work right here for you in the audience, but I've made a tiny URL link so you can go along with the slides. I made pretty slides so you have something to look at that's not me while I'm talking kind of person. So go to the slide link. It will be great. tinyurl.com/defconsucho, DEFCONSUCHO. So you can follow along with the slides, and I'll try to cue you for flipping through them as we go. And they'll also be in the recording, apparently. All right, yep, so I'm Quinn Dombrowski. I am what's called an academic technology specialist at Stanford in the Department of Non-English Literatures and the library. And I'm talking about building Onramps for emergency web archiving in Ukraine and beyond. So I'm from kind of a broad interdisciplinary field called digital humanities. You may or may not have ever encountered it. Until very recently, there was an Office of Digital Humanities in the National Endowment for the Humanities that provided a lot of grant funding to do everything from creating online exhibits of different historical materials that people have digitized, creating tools for text analysis across many languages. One of the projects that I work on is called the Data Sitters Club, where we take the Babysitters Club corpus and walk through computational text analysis step by step. And it dates back to the mid 20th century. One of the figures that is often cited is Father Busa, working on a index using punch cards. Of course, another thread of digital humanities work has been uncovering the history of the female punch card computer operators who actually did the work. So since then, and in recent decades, there's emerged a thread of socially engaged digital humanities. So people using the skills, sort of the technical skills that we have, and combining them with our interest in social issues, in helping support people who are dealing with oppression from governments, dealing with issues around disaster relief. And there were several projects over the last decade that have gone this route, including Torn Apart Separados, which was tracking ICE's territory and infrastructure and prisons, which before there was nearly as much to do as there is now. The Nimble Tents Toolkit, which was a response to Hurricane Maria, trying to do disaster relief mapping, and Data Refuge after the beginning of the first Trump administration. And for all of those projects, I had decided, this was not my lane. I didn't need to get involved. My lane, somewhat bizarrely, was the intersection of originally medieval Slavic, so medieval East Slavic, and technology. I got a BA, MA in medieval Slavic and comparative Slavic linguistics at the University of Chicago, and started a PhD program, quit once I realized that there was nothing that I wanted to spend 5+ years of my life on, and what I was really interested in was helping other people solve problems and do research in a different way. One way or another, I ended up on a Mellon-funded grant for building digital humanities cyber infrastructure that's most well-known in its community for failing after spending over $1 million, which is a lot of money in the humanities. And then my funding got cut, as we all often experience in these somewhat contingent positions. I found myself supporting the high-performance computing cluster at UC Berkeley when that rolled out for a year. And I planned to leave the field altogether and just do HPC support, where I got to be yelled at by both the users and the sysadmins all day, every day, before basically my dream job opened up at Stanford that brought together the non-English literatures, the computational things, and really trying to help people do research better. So I feel like there's some sort of cultural commonalities between what we do in digital humanities, mostly as humanities scholars who have taken a pivot into technology one way or another, and some of the ethos of DEF CON and hackers. By and large, most of us are nowhere near the level of technical sophistication of this community, but there's a similar way of learning how to learn things that ends up being the crucial skill rather than any one particular technical skill. How do you figure out problems when faced with new challenges and new areas of technology that you haven't encountered before? How do you wrap your head around that? And I will say, in the days and years leading up to 2022, I was very happy in that I had never done web archiving. I thought web archiving was great. I was glad the Internet Archive exists. I was glad there were other people who cared about that kind of thing, and I was happy that I didn't have to. And then February 24th, 2022 came along, and I was taking the train home from work. I lived 2 hours away by public transit, and all I could do was just doom scroll the news. And all of a sudden, all of my excuses for why I didn't need to be involved, why this wasn't my lane, blah, 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 all faded away. If I was ever going to be involved in socially engaged digital work, this was literally it. These were languages that I knew. This was a culture that I knew something about. And we were in a position to try to do something. So crucially to Russia's 2022 full-scale invasion of Ukraine is this idea that culture was really at the heart of it. Part of what they were doing was not just trying to conquer land, but also trying to claim that Ukrainian cultural heritage and Ukrainian culture were in fact Russian, that Ukrainian was not a separate language. And so really this was and still remains to be a battle for kind of the cultural soul of a nation and what is considered legitimate and who gets to have a country, who gets to have a language. And so, very much squarely in the kinds of work that I do in digital humanities. On February 26th, there was a tweet, back when we all used Twitter. We're all on Blue Sky now, the digital humanities community. But back in February 26th, there was a tweet from Anna Kias, who was a music librarian at Tufts, who was trying to organize a virtual data rescue session, for a couple weeks in the future, basically to get all the music librarians to get together and archive the music collections that Ukrainian cultural heritage workers had put online. And this was exactly what I needed to get out of the doom scrolling break, the idea that we could and should do something. So on the other side of the world in Vienna, Sebastian Majstorovic replies that maybe the folks at Web Recorder could get involved, and pointed out the open source browser tricks web archiving crawler, really with a forward-looking idea of, yes, we are sending things to the Internet Archive, lots of people are sending things to the Internet Archive, but what if we did this in a more distributed way using open source tools? And since my introduction was through someone on the other side of the world, I had no idea that Ilya Kramer here, wave Ilya, thank you, lived down the street from me, just across the bay in San Francisco. So they quickly got involved. And one of the challenges was there was no roadmap for how to do this. We figured that the people who had done the web archiving prior to Trump's first term would have written down some instructions. It turned out no. Also just very, very different circumstances. When you're talking about a presidential transition, there's a period of time where you can assume that at least you could assume back then that, there were competent IT people keeping the government websites up for a solid number of months and you knew how much time you had. These, for us, were websites that may have been actively under attack in terms of the servers, in terms of the power infrastructure, the network infrastructure. There was no roadmap for how to deal with this sort of uncertainty and instability with the things that you're trying to archive. So we wanted to start with some familiar free tools. We spun up a Slack instance. We had a giant Google Sheet. We started sending people who were less technically proficient to, put things in the Wayback Machine in the Internet Archive. And the folks at the Internet Archive, especially Mark Graham, were there in our Slack answering questions, scaling up capacity as people kept sending them links. But we also wanted to take this distributed approach. So March 1st, we launched the project. Sebastian paid out of pocket for our first servers and infrastructure, and we just started doing this because we felt like every hour counted. We didn't know if Kyiv would fall in a matter of days or weeks or what. We didn't know how long we had, and there was a lot to do, considering all the different websites and libraries and archives that we were able to find, and the many more that we tried to find, whether or not we knew they existed. By March 2nd, we had 400 volunteers. 419 people signed up for Slack on the first day. Lots of them were people who had some connection to the region. Maybe their families came from Eastern Europe. Some of them had connections to the technology and the approach, the idea that web archiving is important and they had the skills to help. And there were just lots of everyday people who, saw there was a way they could sign up to do something concrete and they wanted to do it. So a couple days later, on March 4th, the Internet Archive had a power outage, and the Wayback Machine was down both for archiving and for viewing things for several hours. And in this situation where we felt like every minute counted, this was a big problem. We had anticipated the threat of, Russian attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure, but we had not considered the threat of our extremely janky Northern California power company. So that really, put an end to the work that some of us were able to do, and certainly everyone that we've been sending to the Wayback Machine had to pause that work. But it was an opportunity for people to also think about, are there other things they could do? Would they be willing to take the technical leap to learn a different tool and do something more complicated? And by having people coming from all over, mostly the North America and Western Europe, we would have fewer single points of failure. Maybe the power is out in Northern California, but it continues apace in Vienna. So we were able to help people skill up and scale out. We taught people how to install Docker. We had these Zoom sessions where literally we would hand-hold people through installing Docker, through running the web recorders, different software platforms using Docker and different tools, even if they had never seen the command line before. We had people who, started archiving websites. And one thing that they don't tell you about web archiving is when you pick a website to archive, it's like sticking a straw into a body of water. And you don't know if it's a can of soda or the ocean. But you get emotionally invested in the website that you've chosen, and you see that the number of pages grows and grows and grows. And so we would have people who started just deleting all the video games off their computer hard drive to make more space for Ukrainian museum data. We had people pulling out all their old laptops and stacking them all up around their desk, and they send us pictures. We had someone actually set up the whole browser trick software using a Raspberry Pi device. We have instructions on that online too. Any single device that could be used to crawl websites, people were using it and gathering data. And our community of participants ended up spanning from children to retirees. We had one volunteer, sit down and archive a website with his child, and then the child drew this drawing that you can see if you see the slides. Of what that looks like to archive a Ukrainian website. And I thought to myself, fascinating, I too have children. And so what we ended up doing was organizing, as far as I know, the first ever community web archiving event in an elementary school at Malcolm X Elementary School in Berkeley, California. We had an event on Zoom. It was still sort of post-pandemic times, and parents weren't allowed in the building. We had an event on Zoom where we got a group of families together, and the kids archived a set of sites that we had specially set aside for them that were like children's libraries and other things with colorful pictures that were accessible. So throughout the rest of the project, I had a junior archiving assistant in my then 8-year-old, now a disaffected tween here in the front row, humoring me. And he was there when he would come home from school. He would want to sit down with Slack and see what needed doing, and archive more sites and do things to help. So our workflow, more or less, from the beginning was discovery. We started with user submissions, Wikidata, domain intelligence, some map-based discovery, working with Slavic librarians. Then we did prioritization, trying to figure out what the most important collections were, what was at risk. Triage, technically, around how easy it was to crawl and whether it needed scraping. Actually doing the crawling, and we used a variety of different tools, including sending things to the Wayback Machine, and kind of the full range of the web recorder tools. And then finally, quality control, checking it with multilingual volunteers to make sure that we did actually get things reasonably comprehensively. We had a giant spreadsheet. At some point, we had several hundred people editing the giant spreadsheet in Google Sheets all at the same time. We started off looking at the giant spreadsheet that the folks before Trump's first term used to gather the government data, and we thought, well, this spreadsheet is far too complicated. We'll do something simpler. Of course, we ended up with an equally complicated spreadsheet that met different needs. Initially, we tried to use the IP address to physically locate where the server was and prioritize ones that were in Ukraine on the thought that those are ones that might have physical damage as a result of Russian attacks. But eventually, it didn't take us too long to realize that even things that are hosted externally to Ukraine are equally at risk because refugees are not necessarily good at paying their hosting bills. So we just tried to take anything. If it was cultural heritage broadly scoped, we tried to get it. We were also prioritizing with open source intelligence. We were looking at where there were missile warnings and other places where the cities were directly under attack. And when we would see this was going on in a certain area, we would have volunteers go into Google Maps and virtually walk through the streets of cities under fire, looking for the little cultural heritage icon, and then looking to see if they had a website that we didn't already have in our giant spreadsheet. So what we archived is very diverse, and I wish I had slides to show you the pretty pictures of them all. 18th century music manuscripts, National Museum of Folk Architecture and Life, their website of, again, a lot of these are thatched roof buildings and things that are not going to do well if they end up coming under direct fire. There was a lot of virtual museums and virtual walkthroughs, and so we actually had a couple of volunteers who became really specialized in how you archive like a 3D walkthrough of a space, which is its own special thing. And then little everyday places that people go to engage with cultural heritage, or at least they did before the war. Things like after-school dance programs for kids with pictures of recitals, or other aftercare programs where kids learn Ukrainian culture and language. These are things that, are, if they survive, they're going to survive in a very radically transformed form. And we wanted to be able to capture the work that people had done creating these and putting them online before the war. So what we discovered eventually is that what exists digitally is just a tiny fraction of the cultural heritage of Ukraine. And we were adamant in the beginning that we wanted to stay in the virtual space. This is what we were good at. We were distributed all over the world. We obviously could not walk into Ukraine and help people digitize things. We just wanted to stay virtual. But the feedback that we kept getting from the libraries, archives, and museums was, we have so many more things that we need to digitize. Can you help with that? And so we tried. We were able to find someone who had contacts in Ukraine, and were able to actually order scanners kind of through the Ukrainian shipping channels so that we didn't have to deal with cross-border tariffs and other issues. We ended up getting a grant from the Pearl Jam Vitalogy Foundation, and that funded a lot of scanners, and ultimately power banks ended up being equally or more important for Ukrainian libraries, because as Russia attacks the power grid, having a power bank was enough for people to come use the library as a community center, recharge their phones, and still kind of play an active role in those communities. But the digitization work has continued at a pace, and while the digital is no substitute for the physical objects, and it comes with its own set of challenges around preservation, it's at least one option. We ended up developing a gallery, gallery.sucho.org, sucho.org, where for people who were digitizing things but didn't have any infrastructure for where to put those images, we had a place that they could use. We worked with Yulia Ilchuk, a faculty member in my department, to translate the interface to the open source Omeka software fully into Ukrainian so people could operate it in Ukrainian for the first time. So we still have a variety of things available through that gallery. One of the really fun things that we ended up developing was a project led by Anna Rakhtianskaya at Harvard and my colleague Simon Wiles at Stanford, is the meme wall. And thinking about it, we realized that memes of today this is cultural heritage. These are the letters that people were mailing back and forth during World War II. This is how, especially in the diaspora, people experienced the war through these memes that get posted on Telegram channels, that get shared by your aunt in Ukraine. So if you go to memes.sucho.org, it's pretty mobile friendly. That's a nice technical achievement of this one. We've got, at this point, I think over 8,000 memes that have been downloaded and fully annotated, translated into English, annotated with which figures are being used, which meme templates are being used, and this is really meant to be a public resource, both now and for historians of the future to understand the narrative of the war as it was experienced. We ended up developing an internship that placed college-age Ukrainian students into museums and libraries and archives that were, up to this point, kind of disproportionately full of people who were Soviet-trained, very old school, not digital, and these students created these beautiful digital exhibits that they've shared with the collections of those museums, really with the hope of cultivating the next generation of cultural heritage professionals in Ukraine. Recently, we've released the Web Archive database, where we've gone through and audited all of the web archives that we created, and links them back up the metadata of where they came from, who created them. If you go to database.sucho.org, you can see that and you can browse all the records. And this is the piece that took months and months and months to do. This cleanup always takes longer than you ever anticipated. And it's something that a lot of projects just never get around to. But through the tireless work of Andreas Segerberg and Anakias and a variety of other volunteers, we actually now have this record of all of the web archives. So it's still not over. You never go into this sort of project if you understand what you're getting into, I think. I think you have to not know to be able to leap in and do this. We had hoped that Ukraine would win the war and throw out the Russians, and we could be at the rebuilding stage now, and that hasn't happened yet, and there's no end in sight. Even after Sucho won the Europa Nostra Cultural Heritage Champion Award a couple years back, there's no culmination, there's no end to this. One thinks of the quote, "You're not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to desist from it," and that's where we find ourselves now. It's worth asking, was all of this needed after all? The fact is, a lot of these websites that were down for a while did come back. Maybe the power was restored. Maybe they were able to find other sources of funding to pay for the servers elsewhere. There wasn't a whole lot that we know of that ended up going down and staying down, and our stuff is the only copy. So, did we need to do all of this? I would argue, yes, that it was worth it, that if only as an experience of what happens when you get a bunch of volunteers from around the world to do this sort of thing. We're still trying to write up a guide for how to do it. And, even though a lot of the Ukrainian websites came back, who's to say that the next disaster or the next war will have websites that end up being as resilient as these have ended up being. It's happening here too. I had some great slides, I swear. This one is a letterpress poster, a quote from someone else within the digital humanities community. "There's nothing more ephemeral than a website." We're seeing this now in terms of the changes that the US government is making to its own websites, to its own materials, to its own archives and collections. Things are being deleted and destroyed quietly and not so quietly. And there's a lot of people rushing to archive and preserve what we can. One of these initiatives is a data rescue project that Sebastian Majstorovic co-founded with Linda Kellum. And they're working on trying to get data sets that have been published under government auspices. At this point, over 1,100 data sets across 86 government offices and 150 volunteers working on trying to create safe harbors for this data, both within the US and outside of the US. So when we started this project, we had this somewhat lofty concept that the future of web archiving needed to be nimble tents and bunkers. That emergency web archiving, like what we were doing, is sort of like making Molotov cocktails. And in the early days of the war in Ukraine, there were these images coming out of like people gathering together in town squares, everyone bringing their empty glass bottles, making Molotov cocktails. And that's sort of how we imagined what we were doing. We were able to ramp up really quickly by not being an official, institutionally sanctioned initiative, certainly going through official channels at my university and like having Stanford store all the data. Everything would have taken much longer than we felt like we had. So people can respond very quickly and do things. But the hope was that libraries and archives, national libraries and governments can be a long-term bunker for this data kind of after this initial ramp up of people, because the people ramp up falls off over time as people move on with their lives and have other things that they need to do. And the hope is that institutions could step up, especially right now in the case of what's going on in the U.S. It seems like institutions and governments may in fact be more of a liability than a help in this scene. So maybe this even more so, brings to the fore the importance of learning and teaching tent building. That maybe we as a community, whatever set of communities you see yourself as being part of, like, you need to be the person who does this web archiving. If there are things you care about, you need to take care of them because there's not someone else that you can count on and ensure that like things will just be fine. So if you check out the slides. Eventually, there's a link to a DIY web archiving zine that we've put together, really trying to like lay out the process and the tools for anyone to be able to pick up web archiving and do it and store it, save it on flash drives, make a copy of the flash drive, mail the flash drive to a friend. This may, in fact, be what the future of web archiving, practically speaking, looks like as, governments become liabilities and organizations like the Internet Archive come under fire from those governments and lawsuits and all of that. So, in conclusion, access takes us all, and it really takes us all with a span of us all that's much bigger than the people in this room. It takes retirees who have time on their hands and a willingness to try new things. It takes kids who ask, what about the children's libraries? Like, is anyone writing fanfic? Who's taking care of the fanfic archives? It takes people with a really vast set of experiences, skills, domain expertise, the librarians, the people who would have been librarians in another life, and just everyday people from all swaths of life to be able to do the work that we're going to need to be thinking about access in the future, which may be in a somewhat radically different way than we've had the luxury of thinking about it to date. So, thank you so much. Oh, yes, so the slide URL is tinyurl.com/defcon sucho, SUCHO, DEFCON SUCHO, and it has some nice URLs in it and all kinds of other things, that fun pictures, drawings by children, drawings that we commissioned from Ukrainian artists. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, tinyurl.com/defcon, DEFCON, sucho, SUCHO, all one word, lowercase. Yeah. We do, at least for the web archiving piece of it. If you go to database.sucho.org, that's where a lot of it is, and we do have other stats from the project in terms of numbers of donations, number of institutions we've been able to supply with different equipment on the sucho.org site, SUCHO.org. Yeah. So that's been a bit of an adventure too. We've been lucky to have several institutions willing to kind of host our data or to host copies of our data in their own S3 buckets, to help defray the costs overall. We ended up migrating off of S3 and onto Wasabi as our major data provider, and they've committed to, I think, at least 5 years of storage on it. The hope was that we could give all of this to a National Digital Library of Ukraine that was being facilitated by UNESCO. But as far as I know, that never really got past the planning stage. There was like a long process for UNESCO deciding to allocate $30,000 to like have a planning process. It clearly was not going to like happen anytime in the meaningful future. So yeah, we're just holding on to it for now. And it's a strange project insofar as like really the best case scenario for us is like to just delete it at the end, to be like, check in with the people whose stuff it is and say like, oh, you've got your stuff, you feel good about that, like, all right, no problem, like we'll clear that off then. That's our ideal scenario. But kind of the longer that this drags on, the less likely that is going to be the case for a lot of these places. Yeah. I mean, where we've ended up is, kind of a loose network of folks, a lot of whom were based in the EU, especially Germany, hosting things over there. But I imagine any kind of centralized thing that gets big enough is going to face challenges of one sort or another. So the super decentralized route seems like the safest, even though it obviously comes with like significant downsides logistically. But yeah, I mean, ideally these are both options. But yeah, not everyone necessarily has friends who like to run servers in Germany, but that's that's how we've managed it largely so far. Yeah. No. That's a great question, and we got that one a lot in the beginning. I mean, people we didn't, as far as we can tell, like end up with any sort of like dodgy sites on our list. I mean, we were pretty actively looking at that spreadsheet, and we did have this sort of like workflow that involved approval. A lot of people ask about, sort of Russian hacker interference. We never really saw any of that. There was a point at which the meme wall got this like massive influx of views from Russia. So clearly someone posted it on some kind of message board someplace, and that led to this spike. But it wasn't like there wasn't really any evidence of like, malicious attempts to like take it down or anything. But certainly a lot of attention at one point. Yeah, I mean, really the biggest problems that we ran into were, when Russia started targeting the Ukrainian power grid, that had a terrible effect on a lot of things that were hosted there. We didn't get really, I think, any hate mail or things like that, which was interesting. We got some weird mail. You get involved in any sort of like, rescue efforts, and like all kinds of people come out of the woodwork, including like some guy who sort of fancied himself Indiana Jones and wanted to basically go swashbuckling into Ukraine and like rescuing paintings and like running out of the country with them to where exactly was never really clear. So yeah, we didn't get involved with that one. But we did get emails from Ukrainian sysadmins who said, hey, I saw the site that I run is on your list. I see it's marked as down. I was able to get it back up last night. Can you please archive it as soon as you possibly can, so that if it goes down again, at least I can sleep better. So yeah, it was really a situation where if we had more foresight and had been planning ahead and, started working with Ukrainian libraries and archives and museums in January 2022, really when the writing was on the wall, we could have done a lot more, a lot faster, including helping them do more in terms of preserving their own internal files and data that were never publicly exposed on the web and weren't supposed to be. But, by the time that the war had started, everyone whose work was linked to a physical collection was concerned primarily about the safety of those physical collections, and the data ended up taking a back seat, which makes sense, but it's a problem as records go increasingly digital. Any other questions? Yeah. No, you gotta draw a line someplace, and like that was our line. There was a bank website that somehow managed to like find its way onto our list, and I think we didn't archive that one, but we thought about it really hard because it had like a cute little animated GIF of like a tractor like towing a like Ukrainian tank, as was one of the memes of the time. We thought that was great, but we didn't. We were really super broad in how we defined cultural heritage, but like, we weren't trying to do the entire .ua domain. There were other folks that were kind of trying to do that, albeit with like less high fidelity tools and like with less commitment to trying to like get absolutely everything. We certainly had our hands full with what we were looking at, including dealing with things like library catalogs, with the hope that someday, if Ukrainian libraries could compare their holdings at the end of the war to what was there at the beginning of the war through these library catalogs, maybe there's a case to be made with the Hague Convention around destruction of cultural heritage. But a lot of the library catalogs were this really awful, 2000s era Russian software, where one of the grad students, Georgy Karatkov in my department, like read through like this dense PDF manual for this like old Russian software, and tried to reverse engineer it so that we could web archive it or scrape it in other ways. So yeah, there's definitely lots of things that we didn't get, but like we ended up getting a huge array of cultural heritage writ large. All right. Well, if there's no other questions, thank you all for bearing with me on this one.